here with Gisela Ruckert, who is the president of FairVote Canada BC. We're talking tonight about the proportional representation vote, ballot, and referendum. And we're running out of time for the ballots to get in. There's been a lot of discussion about that. We're already in mid-November. So we didn't want to chat too much about the details because there are lots of really good videos out there explaining how the balloting works and how proportional representation would work. But we were concerned more about the campaign itself, about how the proponents of proportional representation have been out there and how those who are opposed to proportional representation have also been campaigning. There's been a certain amount of misinformation. So what would you say, who would you say are the big players that are opposed to proportional representation?
Well, we have an official proponent group called No BC PR, which is led by Bill Thielemann, the same man that led the 2005 and 2009 campaigns against proportional representation.
Okay.
He is a professional lobbyist by day.
Right. He's a former NDP advisor or something?
Yeah. And he is taking a position contrary to the NDP's official position during this referendum by being opposed to the referendum. To proportional representation, pardon me. So that is the official proponent group. There are also other people involved. Suzanne Anton is one of the primary spokespeople. She's done a lot of debates and things for the No PR side.
Okay.
She's a former Liberal cabinet minister and a career politician. Also, Bob Plekas is one of the third name on their registration, I think. He's a former civil servant.
Okay.
Served under various governments. So
right.
That's the official no side.
Right.
The other groups that are also campaigning against it as registered advertising sponsors are mainly the Liberal Party and a few other smaller groups. But the Liberal Party has stated that it is their number one priority this year to defeat proportional representation. So everything that we're seeing and hearing from the Liberals, including our own MLAs here in Kamloops, has been extremely negative against proportional representation.
Right, and I've seen as well, following on Twitter, it seems like every single Liberal MLA is out there using their platform to speak against proportional representation.
Interestingly enough, there was a bit of a controversy about that recently. You may be aware that our Liberal MLAs have held town halls in various places in our community and in other neighbouring communities over the past few months.
Right. And those local MLAs are Todd Stone and Peter Millibar.
Yeah, okay. I'm talking about Kamloops, North Thompson and Kamloops, South Thompson.
Right.
But the same thing has been done by other MLAs in the interior for sure, and I'm not sure how far beyond that. But what they've been doing is hosting these town halls for their constituents and then making the main feature of the evening an anti-PR presentation, which was actually produced by the BC Liberal Party. Oh. So just this week, Radio NL was speaking about how the speaker had given an opinion that this was an improper use of taxpayer funds. So we're waiting to see what the Liberals are going to be doing about that. But so they have certainly been pushing the border between what is an acceptable use of taxpayer funds to do constituency work versus what is clearly a partisan purpose.
Right, so there could be a graying of what kind of resources they're putting in as a Liberal Party, because they raise funds as a Liberal Party, versus the funds that each constituency office is given to do MLA work.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So we actually asked the speaker a question, gave him a description of the event, and asked, "Is this an acceptable use of constituency funds?" And the answer came back, no. So waiting to see where that goes now.
What are the possible repercussions for, let's say, the Liberal MLA who has inappropriately used their constituency funds for something that's been registered as Liberal Party advertising?
Well, what has already happened since we actually asked the speaker and gave that, we CC'd the MLAs on our letter to the speaker. is that they've changed the PowerPoint. So they've taken out the Liberal Party branding, which is, to me, common sense, and it shouldn't have been there in the first place. They aren't supposed to have, calls to action to join the Liberal Party and all that sort of thing at constituency events, which the PowerPoint was full of. So they've already made some changes in response to even just the fact that it was pointed out to them that this was inappropriate. Whether or not they choose to make changes in the way that they're accounting for the expenses that are being that were used to put on these events remains to be seen. I unfortunately don't know exactly what the process is. This is not an arena that I'm familiar with. But I would hope that if the Speaker has ruled that this event is not an appropriate use of taxpayer funds, that it would get billed towards the BC Liberals' referendum expenses as dictated by Elections BC finance rules. Right.
Now, what would you say are some of the biggest or most misleading comments made or accusations made by those who were opposed to a PR?
Well, I'm not telling you anything new here by saying that we have actually used the word lying when describing the messaging from the no side during this campaign. It's really disappointing to see the level that they're stooping to. It's strictly a fear, uncertainty, and doubt campaign. I don't know if you've seen the word FUD. I learned what FUD was through this process. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt is a tactic that is often employed by we've seen it from the tobacco industry. We've seen it about climate change denial, that sort of thing, where you don't actually have any evidence on your side, so your strategy is to create fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. So the three key messages that they are hammering away on are, first of all, that constituents will lose local MLAs. You may have seen these ads. There's a little old lady phoning trying to get through to her local MLA, and she gets a recording saying the MLA has moved to Vancouver, and there's basically no more access to a local MLA for her. Totally incorrect. Each of the three systems on the ballot maintains, and I would even argue improves, local representation. So I don't think that one's defensible in any way when people look at the systems that are on the ballot. It doesn't stop them from continuing to run these ads both on TV, on social media, and even in our local newspaper. The other argument, the second one that they're making, is that all the power will shift to the Lower Mainland. And they're only making that argument in the interior. They're actually saying something else, I think, in the Vancouver area. But the ads that we're seeing here show a weigh scale with Vancouver outweighing the rest of the province. And our MLAs have said publicly that we will lose MLAs. We will lose local MLAs in our region. Again, 100% false. When you look at the Attorney General's report, which was the basis of the legislation that is being put forward in this referendum, we see that there is it's a watertight guarantee that no region of the province will lose MLAs. So this idea that we're suddenly going to shift some MLAs from regions like ours, the Central Interior, to Vancouver, or have representation from that area that used to be local, is simply false.
Well, isn't there even a part that says we're going to need more MLAs to ensure that we have all these areas covered?
Well, they were saying that initially, but when the legislation was approved, it was quite clear in saying that all of these systems could be implemented with zero increase. But the government has allowed themselves a bit of wiggle room. If the systems might work a little better, they've allowed up to 8 new MLAs. So we currently have 87. That might bring the number up to 95. Less than a 10% increase, and only if needed by this specific system that wins in the second part of the ballot. And the third argument that the opposition is putting forward is that we were going to be electing a lot of extremists. And we have seen pictures with goose-stepping Nazis and, tire fires in the streets and various scare images, pictures of citizen revolts, basically. And I think that is just the most ridiculous argument. It turns out that when you look at the evidence of countries that use proportional representation, they do tend to elect a few smaller parties have a better chance
Yeah.
of being elected. So a few parties that we might label extreme might gain a seat or two. But first past the post is the only electoral system that allows a minority of voters to control the entire government.
Right.
So what we see happening in places that have elected these sort of right-wing populist parties, whatever you want to call them, in places like Germany or like Sweden, is that the other parties simply refuse to work with them.
Right.
So what happens is you have greater transparency. These people that are currently holding these views get sort of chased out of the big tent parties and end up forming their own parties, which makes them more transparent from the get-go. But they're also rendered powerless because no one wants to work with them.
Right.
So I feel that it's a completely... it's an inflated threat to start with, and even if that were to happen, it's not like they would ever be holding the balance of power or they would be exercising any level of significant control within our government. The idea that suddenly we are going to be electing Nazis here in British Columbia, or that there are these extremists that are going to be popping up from behind every hedge, is just ridiculous.
Right. Well, in the States, you have first past the post in their college electoral system.
Yep.
And, if you ever need an example of serious systemic racism and neo-Nazi and neo-fascist appearing, you need not look any further than that system.
Yes.
And a lot of people have said that someone like Donald Trump has actually won elections based on a lot of the rhetoric, and you can even look at the direct links between strategy speech-wise of what Adolf Hitler himself used, and see it repeated by Donald Trump. So...
I think that's an excellent point. Two things I'd like to say is, one, Donald Trump was not elected with a majority of the vote. If they had had a proportional system, they would have Hillary Clinton as the president because she won more votes.
That's right.
But the other thing that I think is worth pointing out is, I think that's an excellent example of how a party with less than 50% support ends up taking control. And even the way that he took over the Tea Party is in itself another example of how you don't actually have to have majority support. You just need a strong enough core to be the plurality in that system. But you don't need to look as far afield as even to the United States. We've got two governments in Canada right now that are threatening to use the notwithstanding clause of the Constitution to put forward legislation which is not supported by a majority of voters in those provinces.
Right.
So, it might be unfair to call Doug Ford an extremist, but he's certainly a populist leader, and he certainly is making changes that 60% of the people didn't vote for.
Right.
So this is under first past the post, and I think that proportional representation actually provides a bulwark against that kind of domination by a party that doesn't have 50% of voter support.
And they had a speaker on CBC Radio the other day on their midday call-in talking about, in fact, the situation in the United Kingdom where they have first past the post, sees the current governing Conservative Party with a certain number of UKIP members, which are where a lot of the neo-fascists and far right-wingers have gone into, and the Conservative Party, because they're barely holding on, are appealing to the type of policies that group wants to have implemented. So here you have first past the post, and you still have extremist. So you, like you say, it's not specific to a certain electoral system. It's specific to the cultural and political environment in a country.
Exactly. And I think it would be a mistake to assume that those forces don't exist even in Canada. We've seen the barbaric cultural practices hotline put in place by a party that is one of the big mainstream parties in Canada. Those people are among us now. They don't change their views because of the electoral system. But what happens is that they become more publicly, more subject to accountability by being more transparent under a proportional system. You know what you're getting a little more. You don't. Right now, we don't know what kind of deals go on between those elements in the big tent parties.
Yeah, very true. So it seems, I mean, when I look back historically, the fight for electoral reform, you see this with a lot of union movements. They don't use first past the post typically. You need 50% plus one to hold office in most unions, right from the grassroots level to the very top. And at the opposite end, always trying to preserve the current first past the post system seem to be the most right-wing elements of our political system. Now, in this time, we could just look at the current example. You have the Liberal Party, which is the most far-right successful party in BC in recent history, and before them, I mean, some of them were literally SOCRED MLAs and then became Liberal Party MLAs, and the business community went directly from supporting SOCREDs to supporting the Liberal Party. Yeah. And then we see a lot of the corporate entities in BC lining up behind the first past the post system and saying, this is what we were built on. This is historically, it's done well for us. Let's not change it.
Not only that, they're also funding it.
Right.
When you look at Elections BC releases the donor information, we're required to report all donors that make a donation over $250 to any one of the registered advertising sponsors. And when you look at the report of who is donating to the no side, the majority of those people donate $1,200 in one shot.
Right.
And there are even there's even an example of one family where, because you can do this for multiple family members, so you'll see the same names popping up over and over. One family donated on behalf of 12 family members the maximum amount of $1,200.
Wow.
That is in stark contrast to our donors. We tend to have a similar number of donors, but they tend to be much smaller amounts that are given to us. So I guess the point that I'm making is that there is a lot more big money that is on the no side than there is on the side for proportional representation. And I think people should ask themselves why.
Right, which leads to why do you think it is that the most affluent sectors of our society, politically and economically, are fighting to maintain the current system?
You could look at it a number of different ways, and I don't think that there's a definitive answer, but you can certainly make the argument that it's a matter of preserving privilege. You're taking a group of people who have long enjoyed good access to power, and that works for them. So why change it? You could also make a sound argument that much of it is based on misinformation. People have the idea that there will be economic chaos if we adopt proportional representation. This is another message that is a very frequent, that comes out frequently from the no side. But there is no academic evidence in the comparative studies that supports the idea that there is a weaker economy or less growth under a proportional system. So I think that it's also a matter of maybe business people don't realize that under a proportional system you tend to have greater policy stability over time, which actually makes for a more certain investment climate. Right now in British Columbia, we're seeing this, and we've certainly seen it federally when Justin Trudeau took over from Stephen Harper. We tend to have these swings in policy back and forth every time there's a change in government. And there's nothing that is less appealing to major investments than to see these sort of back and forth, right and left swings with no idea what the next 4 years or 8 years will bring down the road. So by moving to a proportional system, and I actually think this is one of the chief features of proportional representation that people should consider, is that you tend to have a far more steady path going forward in policy. So everyone knows what the game is. Everyone knows what the plan is down the road. You're not going to have any surprises where, one government is for LNG development and then the next one comes and wants to get rid of it. Or you tend to have a lot more certainty in terms of what is actually going to happen in policy.
Yeah, even services like childcare, right?
That
affordable
too.
childcare.
Yes. It's an incredible waste of taxpayer money to get rid of community mailboxes and then to put them back in. All of these sort of back and forths that we've seen are a result of a system that gives power to a series of minority governments. They're actually majorities in terms of seats, but they're false majorities because they don't have the support of a majority of voters. Right. They tend to be elected with 39 or 40-something% of the vote. They get more than half the seats, so they can do what they want for 4 years. But then what happens is they get booted out when we get frustrated with them, and the next government undoes everything that they've done rather than building on the work of their predecessors. Right.
And while we're on that, because when you say 40% of the vote, you're talking about 40% of the ballots cast.
Exactly. Right? That's a good point as well.
40% of the ballots cast, because we only get about 60% of people voting typically, means that they only have the support of, let's say, 25%. That's roughly what that works out to. And they're voting with they're governing as though they have 100% of the authority to govern.
Right.
So, when you think about those numbers, you start to question the legitimacy of first past the post in that way.
Yeah. I think that's a very valid point. At least proportional representation guarantees that any legislation passed will, the parties passing it are speaking for a majority of voters. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we just don't have under first past the post.
Yeah. I was actually excited when the Greens and NDP had to work together because for the first time, I think, in my lifetime, we had a majority of the ballots cast represented in government, essentially.
57%. Yeah. It's actually only happened one other time since 1956. It happened in 2001.
Okay.
Do you remember that?
Oh, right.
That was a very interesting little episode in BC's electoral history. Gordon Campbell's Liberals won 57% of the vote, very similar actually, within a percentage point of where we are now with the NDP and the Greens working together. Anyways, 57% of the vote got them 97% of the seats.
Yeah.
You may remember there were only two NDP MLAs in opposition at that time, which, even though that was actually a true majority of voters, that was certainly a result that didn't reflect the popular will again.
Yeah.
So, most of the time we end up with governments that have usually around high 30s, low 40s of voter support, winning more than half of the seats.
So there's concerns about low voter turnout and how that may bring about issues around legitimacy.
For this referendum?
For this referendum, yeah. So, I'll first say that we have municipalities where voter turnout is somewhere around 20% or less sometimes. And sometimes they just had a show on CBC this morning talking about how many mayors were acclaimed. Councillors are unopposed, in which case you have 0% turnout because there's no election to be had.
Yeah, okay.
So, compared to those low numbers, has there been any discussion about what it will be a legitimate type of voter turnout?
The NDP has stated upfront and long before the rules actually were announced that they would honor the wish of the people regardless of voter turnout.
Okay.
So there is no official threshold for legitimacy in this referendum. And I think that it was the right thing to do. I think that it would be great if 100% of people voted, but it's not a topic that many people get fired up about.
Right.
And we've had an example in Canada recently where there was no official threshold set, but then the government used what they called a low turnout to disregard the results of the referendum. That happened after the Prince Edward Island referendum in 2016, where there was no prior threshold for legitimacy announced.
Right.
But afterwards, the government didn't like the results. They didn't like the fact that proportional representation actually won.
Right.
And they said, well, it wasn't high enough voter turnout for us to honor that result. So they used that as an excuse to not go through with it. So I have to give John Horgan credit in that regard, because I think that in every other democratic exercise, it is those who show up who decide. And in this case, that's exactly what will happen. Everyone is encouraged to register to vote, and everyone is encouraged to send in their ballot. But if you don't have an opinion, then that shouldn't detract from making everyone else's opinion valid.
Right. So after all the ballots have been taken in and let's say the province moves towards that. Let's say it's positive.
Yes, let's say that.
Let's say that, and we have proportional representation.
Yeah.
What are the procedural things that need to happen as far as legislation being enacted? And like today we had John Horgan talking about closed lists and open lists, and,
right.
And then in some discussion about what happens with the committee.
Right.
That is responsible for it.
Yeah.
How do you know?
So there are several steps that would have to be gone through in order for this to be in place, the new system to be in place for the 2021 election, which is the stated goal.
Okay.
So the legislation ensures that any election held after July 2021 would be done under the new system. That's also building in a nice incentive for the Green Party to hold the government together until that time, because the flip side of that is that any election before that time would be done under the old rules. Oh. So there is a huge incentive to hold the government together on the part of the Greens and the NDP, right? Well, at least the Greens for sure, and the NDP. So in order for us to move ahead, we need to have, one of the systems will win, and since it's a ranked ballot on question 2, which is the one that asks you about your system preferences, the procedure there is that if there is no clear winner with over 50% on the first count, because there are 3 choices,
right.
the bottom one will be dropped off. That's why we're allowed to rank them 1, 2, 3 if we like.
Right.
And I should also mention that's an optional question. If people have no interest in looking at those systems and they just like the idea of, going with proportional representation or not, even with first past the post, you're welcome to just mark the first question. You don't have to fill out the second. Yeah. So if when we get that result from question 2, if it goes ahead, then there's a lot of things that have to be done within a short time. And probably one of the biggest is figuring out the riding boundaries.
Okay.
And that would be done, as always, by Elections BC through an independent boundaries commission.
Okay.
We normally have these every 10 years, more or less after every 2 elections now. So boundary adjustments are nothing new, but depending on which system is chosen, there could be some significant changes because each system looks at that differently. Yeah.
And I'll just mention there, because this has been something that the opponents of PR have said, well, we don't know what the boundaries will be like. But like you say, these are adjusted regularly anyway, and we don't know what they're going to be adjusted to either.
Right.
But they nonetheless are adjusted under the current system too, right?
Maybe you can answer this, but most people can't. Do you know which current riding boundaries are? How far they go left and right and east and north and south and east and west?
No.
Many people do.
I have a rough idea, and I'm someone who ran in a provincial election. And it was still difficult to recall exactly what the boundaries are.
Yeah, so I find that, boundaries are important. I think that we want to make sure that those reflect the local realities and there is public input into that process. So it's not, I think the important thing to know is it's not done by politicians, it's done by civil servants as part of an independent process. So that's what would happen with respect to boundaries. There's also a lot of other decisions that would have to be made because elections, the Attorney General's report, which was the foundation of this legislation that the referendum is being run under, left open a few questions where there was no clear agreement during the pre-referendum consultation process. So things like you just mentioned, like the question of whether the second part of the ballot under a mixed member system should use an open or closed list, which, again, most people don't actually know what that is, but a closed list is basically where the party gives you a list of candidates and you're accepting the order, the ranking that those are in. An open list is where voters would have the right to say, no, I like this second candidate more than this first one, and then I like this one, and then I like that one. So they can actually reorder the list as a voter. Right. So more voter choice under the second option, the open list. But a longer ballot, slightly more confusing, just a little bit more complex. So I think that's why they left that question open.
Right.
And so questions like that and several other questions would be decided by an all-party committee. Okay. So the parties would each have representatives on this committee, and no single party would have a majority. So again, we'd have to work together in order to come to these decisions. And I've looked at that list, and really there is nothing there that would substantively alter the outcomes under any of the systems. They're design factors that geeks like FairVote Canada, electoral system experts get excited about, but most people, do you know what the reserve quotient means under dual member? Most people have no idea, and really, honestly, it doesn't make any difference to us. We just have to mark our ballot, and that counting process and the way that it all works is done by people who know what they're doing. The same as now. So those decisions, some of these design decisions would be made by the all-party committee, and that's list of things which are still to be decided is readily available. Elections BC has put it into, under dual member, these are the questions that have to be decided. Under mixed member, these are the questions that are remaining open. So those are available if anybody wants to look at those things, but I think most people's eyes will glaze over because it's not something that most of us are even aware of in terms of the language that's used and what it means. It's not part of our everyday vocabulary to talk about the inner workings of electoral systems. So once those decisions are made, then Elections BC does all the boundary work, and then we would have new legislation that would put in place the new voting system. And there we go. We get to use the new voting system in 2021. Oh, and I should also say, after that, we would be using it for 2 elections. And then we've been promised an opportunity to review the choice. So a confirmatory referendum, if you like, where we can say whether it's working for us or whether we'd like to go back to first past the post.
So has there ever been a jurisdiction that chose to go back to first past the post?
There have been jurisdictions which have gone back, but it has never been the people who have chosen to do it. It has been politicians, surprisingly enough.
In fact, that's kind of the case in BC in the late 40s, early 50s.
Although that system wasn't proportional.
Yeah, it wasn't proportional, actually. But it was a significant change in the electoral system, and it was just made legislatively by the government of the day.
Yeah, we've had multiple changes in British Columbia and across Canada of our electoral system. But they've all been done just by legislation. We've never had a referendum that has actually changed the electoral system. This whole idea of having referendums is fairly new because I think it is a fairly complex topic. It's not something that most people would know without doing a lot of homework. So, I think there's room for processes like citizens' assemblies and things who are basically juries of our peers who are tasked with examining the options and making a recommendation, as was done in 2005. But we've now had over 14 of these citizens' assemblies. Each of them has recommended that we move to a proportional system. I don't think we need to keep doing the citizens' assemblies. I think that this time the government has responded to the demand for an improved electoral system by offering us a choice of 3 systems, which, as I said, it's an optional choice. You don't have to engage on that question if you don't want to. But it gives the public the right to choose which system they want of the 3 that have been deemed most appropriate for British Columbia based on feedback from the public and from past referendums. And I don't know if you're aware that the 3rd system on the ballot, which is rural-urban, is actually the STV system with a tweak. We're often asked, why isn't STV on the ballot? Why is the single transferable vote no longer an option? Well, it's because they listened to the feedback that said, we don't like these big ridings in the more rural regions of the province. So what has been done is a new system has been developed where we have STV in urban and semi-urban areas, and we use mixed member in rural areas. So again, that was a direct response to feedback received from the last referendum.
So one of the criticisms, again, invalid, that you would lose some local representation, but I want to offer a criticism of the current system because I've heard folks say that, well, the current system allows me to go talk to my MLA, who's, lives down the street from me in some cases, and he will go and represent my ideas. But, I've talked to lots of people who have gone into a Liberal MLA office, And there's absolutely no way that MLA is going to represent their interests, because they have a different perspective politically and economically and socially.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a false argument to say the current system offers me an MLA that I can go and talk to, and they will go and represent my position.
Yeah, absolutely right. So you pointed out one thing, is that 50% of us are generally, 50% of us, and that's including those who vote strategically, end up having a ballot that goes to elect someone. So we can assume that those people are more or less in alignment with that MLA's views. So good for them. That's about 50% of the population. So right now, the other 50% has no effective representation when it comes to policy. And I think we need to make a distinction between the two parts of an MLA's job. There's policy work, which is working in the legislature and voting yay or nay on specific legislation. There's also the constituency side, where an MLA will help you sort through government business or whatever it is when you're having an issue that you need help with.
Okay.
And I think that for the most part, our MLAs do a really good job with the constituency work, and I think they sincerely want to help all constituents regardless of which party they vote for. But for the other part, the policy decisions, exactly what you've described, I think that first past the post is a logical impossibility in terms of representing the diversity of voices in the riding when it comes to those kinds of decisions. And that is where proportional representation shines, because we no longer have a single MLA that is trying to represent those diverse perspectives.
Right.
We have a different structure, whether it be multiple MLAs in a multi-member riding, or whether it's one local MLA plus another team of regional MLAs. Voters have far more options, and people are far more likely to have a representative from a party whose values they align with.
Right.
And actually, it's usually about 95% in a lot of proportional systems of ballots end up electing someone. So someone whose views you share, more or less, from a party you support. So we currently have 50%. We could go up to 90-95%.
Right.
It's a huge difference in terms of effective representation.
It is.
Yeah.
So, back to some of the divide about...
can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
When we're still talking about local representation, the other part of it, so the one we talked about was on an individual level, is the MLA voting the way that you ask.
Right.
There's also a local component to that. Is the MLA actually representing what my region or riding wants? And I think that's equally important. And people tend to think that, oh no, if we keep the riding small, then we're going to have someone who speaks with our interests in mind. But we have... documented analysis of how often MLAs vote against their parties. And it's less than 1% of the votes where an MLA will actually choose to vote against the party. I think it's it's point something or other percent of the time.
Yeah.
So the idea that MLAs will choose to vote with their constituency when there's a conflict with the constituency and the party is actually a nice, warm, fuzzy myth.
Yeah.
They actually tend to follow the party line because bad things happen to their careers if they don't.
Right. And we've seen MLAs get kicked out. Bob Simpson from the Caribou, he was kicked out of the NDP.
Yeah. There's a really good documentary if people are interested in that. If you Google Sean Holman, SeanHolman, it's called Whipped.
Oh, yeah.
45 minutes, definitely worth watching. If you have any illusions about how frequently MLAs will vote against their party,
right.
It's a really well done documentary with BC examples, like you just mentioned.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
In terms of regional votes as well, when we have a party that sweeps a lot of seats in an area, which is something else that we see under first past the post. In our area here, all of the central interior MLAs are BC Liberals.
Right.
Currently, the BC Liberals are Her Majesty's loyal opposition,
right.
and they don't have any decision-making power.
Right.
So how well represented is our region right now? We don't have a single voice at the cabinet table. We don't have a single voice in the NDP caucus speaking for our area. I'd argue that we have not very good representation right now on a local level with our current system. And tends to happen to different places at different times. Right now it's Kamloops' turn to be out in the cold for 4 years, but this is the norm around the province for certain regions to always be excluded under first past the post. And if we look at voting patterns, we can see that each of the major parties actually has significant support in each area of the province. So under a proportional system, we would end up with MLAs from both government and opposition being elected in each area of the province.
Right.
So this I can't even speak anymore, urban-rural divide that we often hear about is practically eliminated under proportional systems. It's a product of first past the post.
Yeah. Is there any final, succinct message you can deliver to really help people get the an understanding of how important this referendum vote is?
In my opinion, this is the single biggest question that British Columbians will be asked to decide for a very long time. And the reason I'm saying that is because who we elect determines the policy that we get. And whether your issue is, union wages, whether your issue is environmental, whether your issue is healthcare, all of these policies are, to a large degree, shaped by the representatives that we get. And if we want that policy to effectively represent all British Columbians and not just a certain 50% of them, it's really important that we have a system that brings all voices to the table. Right now, we have a system that filters out 50% of our voices, and I think that's not serving us well. I also just want to say that this is a scenario where it's a very low risk and high reward. We have the chance to try it out for 2 elections. If we don't like it, we can switch back. We do not have that kind of a guarantee if we choose to stick with first past the post. We will be with it for who knows how long, with no guaranteed chance to review that decision. So I guess I would just encourage people to do the research, ask groups like FairVote Canada BC through our Facebook page or through our website. Ask your questions, get the information that you need. But it's not a huge leap of faith right now to do this. I think it's an almost ideal scenario where I think many of us are frustrated with our current system. We think there might be a better way. This gives us a chance to try it out.
Great. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thanks so much.
Good night.